Okay, I'm going to offer a video lecture on Rawls. Some of this will very much be a repetition of what we went over on Thursday, and some of it will be an extension of the argument a bit more. In particular, the contrast with and affinities with utilitarianism, and the ways in which Rawls both develops and is different from the Kantian argument. But first, the central argument itself. It may be I can do this all in one video. It may be that there'll be two distinct videos. With luck, the email I sent is something of a helpful template for what's going to unfold here. Please have a look at it, either before or along with listening to this. And please do email me with any questions or puzzles you may have. Okay, so the fundamental idea is that just principles of social cooperation will come out of an initial just situation, that parties in an initial condition of fairness will choose to be governed by principles that will in turn be fair. Of course, that just pushes the question back. So what is this initial condition of fairness? This is one of the ways in which Rawls' argument is just tremendously important, since he constructs his own conception of what an initial condition of fairness would be. And some of it is extremely intuitive and unproblematic and uncontroversial, and some of it is extremely aggressive and ambitious and by no means uncontroversial, which doesn't mean it doesn't have a good justification story, just that it's nowhere nearly as irresistible a justification story as some of the other parts will have. All right, so parties are thought of as under a veil of ignorance with respect to their race, their gender, their position in society, their conception of the good, and their talent. They know that in actual society, when the veil is lifted, they will be real people with a race, a gender, a level of talent, a conception of the good, and so forth. But they do not know which one. There have been dozens and dozens of ways of illustrating this idea. Some have suggested you might think of it as like you're a soul up in heaven looking at parties on earth, looking at actual people on earth, and you know that you will inhabit one of these bodies, but you don't know which one. It's not a bad way to think of it. You know that there are actual people in actual society, you know how they differ, and you know that particular people will have different ambitions and desires, but you don't know which of those positions you will occupy. That's the veil of ignorance. As we'll see, ignorance about race and gender is fairly non-controversial in the sense that it simply expresses a conception of these categories that we have no difficulty justifying. Ignorance about talent is, to the contrary, very controversial, and we'll have to treat that separately. So for the moment, though, I just want you to know what it is that the parties under the veil of ignorance are ignorant of. Parties are thought of as self-interested. They're doing as best, they want to do as well for themselves as possible. This is in contrast with, say, utilitarianism, where we assume a kind of altruism. You must take a kind of interest in all persons equally. Whereas under Rawls' argument, we imagine the parties to be self-interested. But of course, given that you don't know which self you will be, self-interest here then generates a kind of interest in each possible social position equally. Self-interest, though, is interpreted here in a very distinct way as guided by risk aversion, or the max-min. You're avoiding the worst, and that means you choose arrangements that are best off for those who do least well. That's the max-min. And nobody is saying that this is how we get through life. Normally, we don't compare professions. We might be deciding between, say, being a businessman and a lawyer. It'd be very unusual for you to say, okay, let's see what the least amount a businessman earns and the least amount a lawyer earns, and I'm going to choose the highest of those two numbers. That's very unusual. It would be strange and odd. Nobody goes to Las Vegas and puts some money down thinking, what's the worst that could happen? We all know what the worst that can happen would be. You'd never go in the casino at all. But we sometimes operate this way when we buy insurance. And there's a sense in which the decision procedure under the veil of ignorance is a lot like buying insurance, as we'll see. When you buy insurance, you prepare for the worst possible outcome and guard against it being, as worse as it possibly could be. So when you buy your house, your insurance for your house, and for most homeowners, that's money thrown away. Ideally, you get to the end of your life and your house has never burned down. And all that money you've spent on insurance was, in a sense, money you, quote, didn't have to spend, unquote. But obviously, you were right to spend it because in doing so, you avoided what you might call the worst, which would be your house burning down and having no insurance. When you're buying an appliance and the salesman asks if you want a warranty, he might, if philosophically sophisticated, say, care to max min? That would be kind of funny. Care to max min? Care to avoid the worst? Because that's what he's saying. You can buy it, not buy insurance, and if it breaks down, you're stuck. You spend another $20, with luck, it's a waste of your money. But if the worst happens, then you avoid the worst possible outcome by having this warranty, having this insurance. Insurance is a very good metaphor for the max min. I shouldn't say metaphor, illustration of the max min, where you're imagining the worst possible scenario and making sure that one does not, in fact, materialize. So again, to use the illustration I used in class, you might think of, under the veil of ignorance, deciding which city to live in. And if you were using the max min, you'd look at the least well off. So if you were comparing Stockholm and Rio de Janeiro, you don't look at the life that the average, middle-class person has in Rio going to the beach and in Stockholm shivering in the winter. Rather, you'd look at the unskilled laborer. You'd say, okay, how is the janitor living in both? Because when that veil is lifted, if I'm max minning, I'm assuming I'm the unskilled worker. That's one way, one very plausible way to interpret the least advantaged in the marketplace, the one who only has their labor to sell. And you say, well, that's pretty clear. As nice as Rio is, the life of the janitor in Stockholm is clearly much better than the life of the janitor in Rio. So, or if not, that's then why you would go to Rio. But the important point is that you're making these comparisons of these societies by reference to how things are for the least well off, because obviously, if you're max minning, that's what it is you're trying to maximize. All right. So again, you're ignorant of your race, your gender, your conception of the good, your level of talent, and you're self-interested, which here means you're risk-averse and max minning. That's the fundamental decision procedure. You have all relevant general knowledge that relevant to political choice. So for example, that people are very attached to their own children in ways that they're not attached to strangers. And so the family is likely to survive as a unit in political life. If there are inequalities because of asymmetries of family upbringing, those probably have to be lived with. We can do what we can about inequalities that are not the result of that, but Rawls, following Hume here, thinks there are certain limits to what political theory can intrude upon. And that's the sort of thing parties would have knowledge of. It may be that allowing people a certain amount of wealth accumulation as a result of their own efforts has a similar status, and it would be a mistake to try and be excessively aggressive towards that impulse. We can take that up later. But if it is the case, then you want to acknowledge it to the extent that you have to, consistent with whatever the theory otherwise is going to require. All right. I think that's the general idea of the decision context. Now, in that decision context, the natural question arises, okay, so what are the principles that persons would choose? Well, Rawls, I mean, I didn't go into this in class, thinks obviously utilitarianism is a very strong candidate here. He thinks it would be ranked second, in fact, second to the two principles of justice he puts forward as the first choice. Because after all, under utilitarianism, you're guaranteed the best net average. I mean, that's the theory that you would agree to try and make real. And if you have a society that is genuinely committed to utilitarianism, on the assumption that you're the average guy, you're going to do as well as possible, let alone if you're doing better than average. But Rawls thinks, and you can see how powerful and important an assumption the max min is here, under the veil of ignorance, utilitarianism would not come in first. You would choose something else, and you'll choose something called the difference principle for your second principle, and we'll get to that in a moment. But utilitarianism, to use Rawls's famous phrase, does not do justice to the separateness of persons. A high average doesn't guarantee that the person on the low end of that spectrum has a satisfactory life. Whereas the average in America might be very, very high. The average between Bill Gates and, the Amazon delivery guy might be a very high number. But from the standpoint of the average delivery guy, the fact that that number is so high is of very little use to him. And that's the thing that utilitarianism is constantly in trouble with. If you're going for the highest average, certain individuals may be part of a scheme or an arrangement in which the average, while very high, themselves have unsatisfactory lives. And the decision procedure that Rawls has constructed is a very clever way out of that problem. Since under the veil of ignorance, you must, imaginatively identify with each possible outcome, and you'll accept that arrangement which is acceptable from each one individually. You're not interested in an overall average. All right, the two principles of justice that Rawls thinks would come out of the veil of ignorance are, first, the principle of equal liberty. Parties would choose the maximum amount of basic rights and liberties consistent with equal liberty for all. And when we come to economic distribution, you might initially think you'd want equality, but Rawls thinks no, there's no reason not to have inequality so long as the unequal arrangement is an arrangement that benefits the least advantaged, which of course means the least advantaged under this unequal distribution is better off than they would be under any alternative, including equality. How is this possible? We went through this a bit in class. If you think about it a little bit, it's not that hard to understand. For all the deep egalitarian features of Rawls's argument, he's sensitive to the way in which the amount of wealth there is to distribute is not some fixed figure, the way the amount of gold in the world is fixed or the amount of oil in the world is fixed. If wealth were like that, then of course you would go for equality. It would be like that cake that must be cut, where you have to assume you'll get the last piece on the assumption you get, that's classic max min. This is put a variety of ways, cut the cake in a way that your enemy gives you the piece. Well, obviously you got to cut it equally. That's the way to get the best possible piece, because you have to assume any inequality is to your disfavor. But that's when you have a fixed amount of stuff to distribute. In the case of wealth, the amount there is to no small degree a function of what people do and what people make. Think about, this is easily seen in something like food. How much food is there to distribute? Well, that depends in no small part on how much farmers decide to make, how much farmers decide to work. I went through this in the 70s when China liberalized its agricultural policies. Suddenly, this country, which didn't have very much food to distribute to the countryside, had more than enough once it allowed farmers a significant share of the profits from their extra productivity. Suddenly China got much, much closer to self-sufficiency. And analogously, how much productivity there is in a country is to no small degree a function of how much people decide to do or are motivated to do. There are many, many clear examples of this. And so Rawls thinks, under the veil of ignorance, you would accept this more complicated principle called the difference principle. That's what it's come to be called. and that is that it's actually more complicated than what I'm specifying here. I'll go into the complexities a bit, I guess. I think they're kind of assumed, but let's go into it. Differences in wealth, it would, or whatever your index of primary goods would be, differences in wealth are acceptable if they're part of a scheme which is to the benefit of the least advantaged, of those who get less under any unequal distribution. And the assumption is you can move towards equality, but only to the extent that actual people remain incentivized to continue to be productive and generate this social capital to be distributed. The illustration I had is something like Sweden. So, the incentives to work hard and become a skilled surgeon are sufficient that, there's no danger in Stockholm that you won't get first-rate medical care. But the compensations are just what they have to be and no more, and the rest, of course, is redistributed downwards to the least advantaged. Of course, there's a difference in lifestyle and wealth between the surgeon, the chief surgeon of Stockholm General, and the hospital orderly, but that difference is nowhere nearly as great as it would be here in New York, where we are in no way committed to anything like the difference principle, and incentivization is allowed to rise as high as you might like. In a Rawlsian society governed by the difference principle, the incentives are just enough to get that productivity and no more, because anything extra could be used for the benefit of the least advantaged, which under the veil of ignorance, max minning is what the parties would choose. You're beginning to see how controversial and aggressively redistributive this argument is. It's a kind of funny thing that it combines in the first principle a very familiar constitutional guarantee of basic liberties for all. I mean, we can rehearse this. I did this in class, but some of you weren't there. Obviously, if you're under the veil of ignorance, you would not accept any arrangement which gave some liberties and rights to men and not to women, some liberties and rights to whites and not to blacks, obviously, because under the VI, you have to max min and assume you'd be the disfavored minority. So you're going to affirm a position of equality. In this kind of case, the ignorance of gender, the ignorance of race is extremely non-controversial. It simply expresses the thought we can justify apart from Rawls's argument that no instance of this general category is more deserving than any other. Being male doesn't entitle you to a right that being female rightly deprives you of, and same, of course, for race. There's just no good argument for giving the vote only to men. There's no good argument for giving the vote only to whites, which isn't to say we haven't lived under societies which have been governed by such exclusionary understandings. That's hardly the point. The point is, how good is the argument? Well, they're not any good at all. And ignorance of which one you are simply expresses, from a different point of view, this thought. There's no good reason to give one to one version that you wouldn't give, to give the right to one instance of the category you wouldn't to the other. Notice, it's just the opposite with talent. This is very important and very hard. If there's any good reason to give somebody something you don't give to somebody else, it's talent. The reason this guy gets the gold medal and not me is he's the faster runner. The reason this guy makes the salary at, a certain kind of high-tech company and not me, he has a talent I don't have. The reason Bob Dylan has made all kinds of money I haven't made is he wrote the songs I didn't write. If there's any good justification for asymmetrical outcome, it's rooted in talent. So we're going to have to go back to this again and talk about it a little more carefully, precisely for this reason. Under the veil of ignorance, they're all excluded. But I want you to notice the exclusion of something like race and gender is non-controversial. The exclusion of talent is much more complicated, and it's got to get a very different kind of justification, which we will get to either in this lecture or the next. It may be that that's pretty much all I want to say as a general introduction to what the argument is and what it entails. So just to go over the basic points, and then we'll stop, and then I'll come back and say something more about the Kantian interpretation of this argument. So you see this basic idea of the veil of ignorance, that a variety of things are excluded, some of which are uncontroversial in that they express very deep intuitions about equality. Some are not. Under the VI, if you're max-minning, you'll choose these two principles: basic liberties being maximal basic liberties consistent with equality, and then the difference principle, that differences in wealth are acceptable if they benefit the least advantaged. And that's, of course, very different from what you would get under utilitarianism, which looks at the highest average. Obviously, those two will diverge under all kinds of facts. It may be that we have the highest average here in America, and we obviously do not have an arrangement that is to the benefit of the least advantaged compared to other possible arrangements. All right, maybe that's enough for now, and I'll come back later with a bit more.